Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my Ohio garden. While the garden got off to a bit of a rough start this year, things are finally starting to get going. So today I thought I would share with you an update of what is going on in the garden right now, as well as what I am harvesting. So let's jump in. Up front here, we have one of my favorite little vignettes in the garden. I love intermixing flowers and vegetables and all kinds of plants into spaces. So up here, we have my favorite Queenie lime orange zinnias, orange hobbit sunflowers, and some shell beans. And behind, just a few of my many tomatoes I'm growing this year. Growing indeterminate tomatoes on these cattle panel trellises is something that I've talked about in prior videos, but this remains far and away my favorite method of trellising indeterminate tomatoes. It's just so easy and convenient and keeps the plants so nice and accessible. I got my tomatoes planted a little late this year, so I'm just starting to get my first ripe cherry tomatoes. I'm really excited about these. This was a favorite variety from a couple years ago, and it's called Tropical Sunset. And you can see it has these beautiful large cherry tomatoes with great color, and the flavor is fantastic. And then over here, I have two larger beefsteak types, Dark Star and Blushing Star. And these I've seen in other locations, and they've always looked great, but it's the first time I'm growing these in my garden. I'm really impressed with the fruit load on both of these varieties so far. You may notice the marigolds and emerald towers basil that I have interplanted with the tomatoes down here. Now, as I've talked about in other videos, I'm not a strong proponent of traditional companion planting, but I do find that marigolds and basil make good bed mates with tomatoes. The plant structures complement each other well, but in terms of the marigolds or basil actually repelling tomato pests or improving tomato growth, I don't find that to be the case here. Now in here, my herb garden has gotten a little bit overgrown. I've got a lot of volunteer cleome popping up everywhere, but this is one of my all-time favorite kind of old-fashioned annual flowers. The bees absolutely swarm to these, and hummingbirds like them as well. They do bear a striking resemblance to another plant, which recently became legal here in Ohio, but they're no relation. I also have lavender, oregano, and some licorice mint or agastaki, all plants focused on the intent of bringing more pollinators into the garden. My Chicago hardy fig is doing well, and I'm very excited because a wonderful fellow gardener sent me a whole slew of hardy fig cuttings that I am just getting rooted in the greenhouse. So I'm excited to add those to my fig plantings and see how they do. Back in this nice little shady nook of the garden, I have my strawberry beds, which are pretty much done for the season, and I just finished tearing out an old raised bed here that was falling apart. Now I'll be working on improving the soil in this bed because right now it's not in great shape, but for the time being, I have an herb and flower blend for pollinators planted in here. Oh, I do have strawberries left. I forgot, I've got my Mara du Bois. They're an ever-bearing strawberry, so I do intermittently get fruit throughout the rest of the summer. Thanks, Bubby. In the beds up front here, I've got lemon basil, which sometimes I wish I could just share these fragrances through the phone or the TV with you guys. The smell's absolutely amazing. And a whole lot of volunteer ground cherries of some sort. I had Cossacks pineapple planted in here last year, and inevitably fruit dropped, I didn't get it harvested, and now I have volunteers popping up everywhere. I'm not exactly sure what this crossed with, but these plants are not coming back true to type, so it's anybody's guess what quality of fruit I will get off of these, but I'm just kind of curious, so I let quite a few of these plants go. They're also serving the purpose of somewhat shading my carrots in here. Now, usually carrots for me are done by the middle of July, but I'm just starting to harvest these. Now, I love showing the varietal differences even in the same class of plants. So take a look at these carrot roots. I have a variety called Berlin and a variety called Envy in here. And there are a whole ton of different types of carrot roots. But you can see here, Berlin is a much stockier, more of a wedge-shaped carrot, and Envy is a longer, thinner carrot. And this bed has fairly light soil, so generally all types of carrots grow pretty well in here. But if I were wanting to plant in my in-ground beds, which have heavier, more clay-rich soil, I'm definitely going to opt for something like the Berlin because those fatter, wedge-shaped roots power down through heavy soil much better. Moving on, I let some of my Mayan jaguar lettuce go to seed. This was an absolute favorite of mine in the spring, a really beautiful and tasty lettuce. I have loofah gourd and moonflower growing up this trellis, along with a few volunteer hyacinth beans. Here is my Gurney Sunny Hedge sunflower blend just starting to bloom. This is a mix that I grow almost every year. It's such a cute little sunflower. And my red foliated cotton here, which I'm really excited about. And I'm glad this is starting to stand back upright. We had some really strong winds come through as an aftermath of Hurricane Beryl, and it knocked a lot of my taller plants over. But many of them are now starting to right themselves. You'll see in a minute my corn plot, half of that was flattened, and those plants are actually starting to stand back up. So I'm glad that my cotton has revived. A few flowers that I mentioned in my prior favorites videos, but I have to brag on these again. And here again, smell-o-vision would be awesome. This jasmine scented Nicotiana is the most wonderfully scented annual flower I have ever smelled. I grow it every single year. So this will close up during the day, but it opens as we move towards sunset. So when I'm out here working in the garden, I just get these amazing wafts of this heavenly fragrance. The wild petunias down here are open during the day and have this really unique, spicy scent. I'm not a fan of conventional bedding petunias, but I do love these wild petunias. And these tend to draw more hummingbirds and hummingbird moths than any other pollinator. And they're really, really easy to grow from seed. You can see here my dill and my borage got knocked over by the storm. This borage, again, is a plant that the bees absolutely love and will volunteer year after year. The flea beetles finally found my planting of eggplant here. You'll see on quite a few plants out here this white residue. This is not powdery mildew. This is the remnants of a product I use called Surround. It's a kale and clay based organic plant protectant. And when you maintain constant coverage, it actually works really well for critters like flea beetles. I like to use it on my cucurbits as well. The trouble is every time it rains, it has to be reapplied. Bordering this bed is a French marigold called Fireball. And I've got basil and bright lights chard here as well. Now, typically chard is a vegetable that I can grow with absolutely no problems. No pests, no diseases, no nothing. And of course, something found me this year. So I have this weirdness going on with my chard. I've not had a chance to look up what this is yet, hoping that some of you savvy gardeners recognize this and can tell me what's going on. This is still edible, it's still growing, but it is kind of unsightly. So I have to figure out what this is and get on top of it. My blackberries back here are really starting to ripen. Of course, we're dealing with the spotted wing Drosophila, but I don't find as of yet that it's so bad that I really have to do a lot for it. Now, insect netting will work, but right now we're just dealing with a few of these discolored drupes. not a whole lot of issues other than that. The berries are still edible. They still taste great. I'm sure that they will become more of a problem here, but as of right now, I'm not doing anything for them. A variety I'm really excited for this year is this, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Zai butternut squash. Can't wait to see how this one tastes. Unfortunately, the squash and pumpkin pests are atrocious this year. I have seen more squash vine borer moths flying around this year than I ever have. The cucumber beetles just moved in enormous numbers, and squash bugs are always a problem. Now, butternut squash do tend to fare better against some of these pests, especially the squash vine borers, than other squash types. However, I have already mentally prepared myself for the fact that I may be losing all of my plants. I've been using a combination of tactics, trying to keep surround covering these plants, which I've found in the past really helps. That's been extremely tricky this year because we keep getting these intermittent pop-up showers. Not a ton of rain, just enough to wash my surround coating off, and I'm not able to get out here every single day and reapply it. I actually broke down the other evening and did an application of Piola, which is a pyrethrin-based insecticide, to try to knock down some of the numbers of cucumber beetles. I'll talk a bit more about that a little later in the video when we look at the melons. But I've also already found squash vine borer larvae in some of my pumpkins. Now, I know that some folks like to inject their pumpkin stems with BT. I didn't have any needles or anything on hand. So what I tried to do was clean out that entry site really well with a pin and then just spray BT solution directly in. I then covered up the stem with some more soil. I've also been dusting the stems of all of my squash and pumpkins with diatomaceous earth because I read somewhere that that can help with the squash vine borer larva. We'll see if it makes any difference. I think going forward, I just really need to reevaluate my strategy here. I either need to take a break from these crops here in these gardens for a couple of years, or just really reduce the number that I'm growing so that I can manage them organically more effectively. Right now, I just have so many, it's a little overwhelming. And speaking of pop-up showers, here comes another one. Rain break. Now back here is my lunch lady gourds that are taking over the planet. This is an area where I just started a compost pile, and I use the term compost pile roughly because I don't manage my compost piles. I just kind of dump everything in place and wait for it to rot. But I like planting my pumpkins or gourds directly into the compost pile because everyone knows that volunteer pumpkins that sprout up in the compost pile are the best pumpkins. So I just go ahead and plant my stuff in there, and so far this is doing really well. On this trellis, I have an Armenian cucumber or snake melon, and this is a fun one. This is Purple Muse Millet. This kind of had a slow start, but these are starting to fill out, and this color is looking really good. My cucumbers on the trellis are doing well so far, but again, these may go downhill really, really fast if they start getting bacterial wilt, which is the disease spread by cucumber beetles. Now, a great illustration here again of the differences in varieties. I wanted to show you guys these two varieties are actually more for greenhouse culture, where you would train a single leader up, essentially a rope system, and harvest along that single leader. You can see this habit where this guy is just kind of sending up one central leader, and I'm already running out of room at the top of my trellis. Something else with these varieties that are intended for greenhouse culture is that most often they're meant to be grown in isolation. So this would typically be the only variety you would be growing in that setting. You wouldn't be growing any other varieties of cucumbers, and that is to avoid cross-pollination. Because what happens when these cross-pollinate with another cucumber variety is you get these weird, misshapen, swollen-looking fruit. And this is because we now have seed development going on in here. So essentially, a breeder once explained this to me as it's almost like these are getting pregnant, and so they're swelling up with seeds. Whereas if you grow these in isolation, these fruit are going to stay nice and thin and uniformly slender down the whole length of the fruit. So these were trial varieties. The fruit early on was really nice, but now these are kind of useless to me in the garden. So it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're picking out varieties in the spring. But further down the trellis, I've got Tasty Green, which is a Japanese slicer variety that I've grown in the past and have always been really happy with. Hopefully you can see here, this one is sending out a lot more like side shoots where we're getting a lot of blossoms, and that'll be additional fruit production. So really this variety is better suited to the growing system that I have here. It works really well on this trellis. Back here is a bit of a hot mess right now. Thinning some of this out and transplanting elsewhere will be on my fall to-do list. My pumpkins are back here, planted on one of my hugelkultur beds, growing amongst my apricot trees. Elderberries are just loaded this year, but it might be a trick getting to some of this fruit. I do hack these back at the end of winter, beginning of spring, but some of these just grow really, really tall. Now back up into the main part of the garden. Some castor beans planted here. I really love this variety because of the red coloration. Really, really showy. And you're not going to want to let pets or kids accidentally get a hold of these seeds, but I've been growing them for years and have not had any issues. A few of my determinate tomato varieties. Some chard and nigella going to seed here. I'm doing some timing tests on pumpkins and winter squash. So these were started indoors and I transplanted them out on July 5th. These are winter squash here. I'm going to see if I'm able to get ripe fruit. I'm really running up against that mid-October frost date with these late plantings, but I really want to see just how late I can get away with planting. Mermaid's Aurora cabbage collards. The cabbage worms have kind of done a number on these, but I did just hit these with a BT spray last night, so hopefully that'll slow them down. I think these will be really pretty in the fall because typically that purple color tends to get really enhanced after we have a couple of frosts, so I think these will be beautiful. This is Gaia edamame. You can see the Japanese beetles love edamame. I don't get a ton of pressure here, but this is some of the worst feeding that I get. They definitely gravitate towards these plants. Rabbits love edamame too, for some reason. I had some baby bunnies in here that nibbled off these plants, but it looks like I'm still going to get a crop off of them. I hope these size up a little more because these are teeny tiny. More cosmos, more zinnias, some purple kale tucked in here. I just seeded some morning glories because I needed something quick to climb up this trellis. And one more cucumber. This is an American slicer called Gateway, and I'm trying it because of its disease resistance package. I have issues with anthracnose sometimes on my cucumbers, and this variety is supposedly very resistant to it. So we'll see how that does. But again, you can see the growth habit on this. It's putting off a lot more side shoots than those other varieties and really covering this trellis nicely. More of my wild petunias. And beets are kind of tucked in here a bit. Again, oddly enough, beets are a little late, like my carrots this year. So I'm just starting to harvest these, and I'm harvesting as I need them, getting the biggest roots out of here first and letting the smaller ones size up. And it's kind of nice because, again, these are being shaded a little by some of this volunteer holy basil, which for this time of year works really well for these root crops. And back here, my top chop collards. This is a stellar variety. It does awesome every year. Again, a little bit of cabbage worm damage. I hit these with the BT last night, but this is always a top performer in my garden. My summer squash, I've been sprinkling this one with the diatomaceous earth because I lost my other plant to squash borer. So far, it seems to be working, but we'll see how long this one lasts. Just like my cucumbers, I've already sown a second set of summer squash, started them up in the greenhouse. Those will be ready to transplant out soon. I'll keep them covered with insect netting until they start blooming. And hopefully that way I get another flush of fruit closer to the frost, even if I lose my initial planting. This whole patch of melons, I had these netted until they really started blooming. I took the netting off. I was really excited because I hadn't seen a single cucumber beetle in the garden. And I don't know, a couple days later, they showed up like crazy. I planted late because many times that works with cucumbers. If you plant late, the cucumber beetles can't find any food, they move on and leave your stuff alone. Unfortunately, they found me. The trouble is cucumber beetles transmit bacterial wilt, a devastating disease of melons and other cucurbits. Once they've transmitted the pathogen, there's not a whole lot you can do to control it. You may come out one day and your plants look great. The next day you come out and they're dead. Again, I'm trying to keep these covered with Surround, but I did resort to spraying Piola a few evenings ago. Even though Piola is an organically approved insecticide, it's still an insecticide and a broad spectrum insecticide at that. You have to be really careful with pyrethrins and other broad spectrum insecticides because they will kill everything, even our good bugs. Your safest bet with using these insecticides is to wait until your pollinators are not active. So that's either really early in the morning, or in my case, I waited until after sunset, basically to the point where I had just enough light left that I could see what I was doing, made sure there were no pollinators working any of these blooms, and then sprayed. I'm not trying to be preachy. I just want to make sure that folks are aware that just because something says organic doesn't necessarily mean that it's no harm. So it's certainly going to be a better option than dousing your entire garden in 7, but it is still going to kill stuff. Please just read the fine print on whatever products you decide to use. And in the case of cucumber beetles specifically, unfortunately, they are really hard to kill, especially with the organic insecticides. So I knocked the populations back, but I certainly did not get rid of all of them. Now along here, I've got some of my peppers. The first 2 plants are Greek pepperoncini, which I planned on pickling, but I am not impressed with the amount of blossom end rot I have going on with this variety. The conditions have been right this year for blossom end rot, but BER is more than just a calcium insufficiency issue. It is a calcium uptake issue. So for plants to efficiently uptake calcium, they have to have ample, consistent moisture. And when you have drought conditions or conditions that swing back and forth between drought and too much water, which is what happened here this year, it makes it really hard for plants to uptake calcium efficiently. With tomatoes and peppers in particular, there are varieties that are definitely more susceptible to this issue than others. I've never actually had blossom end rot on peppers before, and none of my other varieties in any of my gardens have blossom end rot, which tells me that this Greek pepperoncini, unfortunately, is really, really susceptible to BER. Now, there are products you can use to help with this issue. I've never actually used them myself. Typically, what I see is as the season progresses and those moisture levels even out, the fruit that gets set later on is perfectly fine. Hopefully that's the case with this one, because I was really looking forward to some pickled pepperoncini. Further on here are some mini snacking peppers that are part of the All-American Selections trial. And at the end, my Pantera jalapeno, which, ooh, I've got a few mature fruit to pick off of here. This batch of eggplants have been struggling heavily with flea beetles since the beginning of the season, but despite the damage, I'm still getting some nice fruit. Now, pass back through these melons. These are going to be completely overgrown here. I'm not going to be able to get down my pathways. Oh, something I wanted to point out here. I'm not a fan of using this fabric weed barrier permanently, but it is a great temporary fix. I didn't have any of my usual alfalfa hay that I like to mulch my garden paths with this year, so instead I used wood chips. I really like these for some applications, but they definitely don't suppress weeds as well as the alfalfa hay, and I was having a lot of weeds already popping up through my mulch. And right now, I just do not have the time to come out here and hoe the weeds out or hand pull them. So I opted for this black landscape fabric instead. This works really well underneath these melons where I just let them sprawl out over top of it. And at the end of the season, after I remove my plants, I just fold this up and throw it back in the barn. I also use it shorter term as a tool to solarize weeds in specific areas. So over here in this corner, I was having a lot of trouble with thistles popping up. And again, I just did not have time to deal with them. So I put this down, I pinned it in place. I'll let it sit in the hot sun for a couple weeks and it'll kill off everything underneath it. Then I can just take this up, move it to another weedy spot in the garden and repeat the process. Beans. These had a lot of neglect on my part, so they don't look great, but I've got a second planting under this net. This is my new favorite bean. This is Blue Lake Superior. So by the time the ones in the back are completely petered out after 3, 4, 5 pickings, these will be starting to produce. So I have a continual flush of green beans in the garden up until frost. Here are the pumpkins that I direct sowed on July 9th, just starting to pop up out of the ground. We'll see if I can get a harvest on these. Again, really pushing that first frost timeline, but I'll let you know what happens. Just harvested the last of my cabbage here. I had Slaw Master cabbage and then a trial red variety in here. Both did really, really nice. Okay, I have to stop and brag on these for a second. And this has nothing to do with my prowess as a gardener and everything to do with this variety. If you want to grow some really impressive onions, I cannot recommend Ailsa Craig enough. So I didn't start these from seed. You absolutely could though. I actually got starts from Dixondale Farms. I fed these once at the beginning of the season with Gurney's onion food. I mulched them and that's all I did. This variety regularly gets up to 5 pounds. They can get even larger if you really have like a regimented fertilizer schedule and are really pumping these guys full of nutrients. But Like I said, I did very little and still get these kind of results. And I've grown these for quite a few years in a row, and these results are typical. It's just a really impressive onion. The only bad thing is it is not a storage onion. So I usually get 3 to 4 months tops with these with optimal storage conditions and practices. It's a lot of onion to eat fresh, but give them away, impress your friends, enter them in the state fair competition. It's a great onion and it's really fun to grow. I got the biggest kick out of a couple years ago when I grew these. I shared some with my sister and she shared pictures of her onion rings the size of my head, and they were absolutely delicious. I'm told she didn't share them with me, but it is a really fun onion. So give it a try. Next, let's take a little wander outside the garden fence. I have to show you these. They're my guilty pleasure of the garden. They're non-native. I didn't intentionally plant them with any purpose other than I just really, really like the looks of them. This is Midnight Marvel Hibiscus, and it's just gorgeous and super low maintenance. I will not put any work or effort into any of my ornamental plantings. So basically this plant got stuck in here and has never received the first bit of fertilizer, of water, of anything. It's just kind of on its own, and it's done really, really well in this location. So I really enjoy this plant. Over here, my Jerusalem artichoke probably got the worst of that storm the other night. It's the only bad thing about this plant is it does tend to get knocked over in summer storms. Some of these I actually tied back up to the fence with baling twine, but I've not gotten to this section yet. I like having these here because they're pretty. They're a perennial vegetable, so you can eat the tubers. They also provide a little bit of late afternoon shade for some of these crops in the first row of the garden. I just don't like that they get knocked over so easily, but there are workarounds to that. Back here is I call it my wild garden. This area does not get weeded. I have a lot of volunteers, a lot of stuff just kind of taking over back here, but my first row of potatoes were dug. This was Carla Rose, and I was not impressed with this variety. I had very, very low yields. But today I'm getting ready to check on some of these other potatoes. Usually by this point in the season, my foliage has all died back, which is my key to start harvesting. And I just keep waiting and waiting, and the stuff is not dying. But curiosity is killing me, so I'm gonna bring you guys with me while I dig a few test plants here and see what we have going on. First, I've got Belmonda, and I've not grown this variety before. These were all planted April 22nd. So that's a lot of plant. This is telling me kind of right off the bat that my nitrogen's probably too high in here, which makes sense because I didn't fertilize back here at all, but I did put several inches of aged sheep manure down in this garden. So you can see that's really beneficial for some of these plants. Like the corn looks fantastic. It's a super heavy feeder, but with potatoes, they get too much nitrogen. They put on a lot of top growth at the expense of putting on tubers. So this first plant here, this isn't bad, but it could be better. Next, I've got Baltic Rose. This is a variety I've grown before and have really had great results with. And man, I had a few in there, but overall that's pretty lackluster. And my last one here is Lehigh. Again, this is one I've grown before and was very, very impressed with. And where are the potatoes? Oh, we've got a couple here, but that's pretty pathetic. So that initial harvest, kind of disappointing. I'll leave the rest of these plants go until they die back more and dig the rest of the potatoes. Hopefully I get a few more, but combination of factors going on here. The nitrogen I mentioned, also really dry early in the season, and these did not get any kind of watering or irrigation. The other thing is potatoes won't set tubers once the temperatures get too hot. I think it's over 85 degrees, and we had a lot of unseasonably warm temperatures early in the season when these should have been kind of in prime tuber production. So I'm not surprised, but I am a little disappointed. Volunteer squash back here, probably the healthiest in the garden. I also have some watermelon back in there somewhere. Back here you can see the corn. The first couple of rows here were completely flattened the other day by that storm. I haven't done anything with these, and you can see they are almost completely self-righted. So about half the time that I get corn knocked over in summer storms, it will right itself. That doesn't always happen, but I'm surprised at how many times it does. And I'm thankful that they did it this time. These are all volunteer sunflowers in here. They're kind of in the way, but I couldn't bear to pull them out. More winter squash in here. This patch is where I just dug up the last of my volunteer potatoes. And I had to laugh because a couple seasons ago, I did a series of videos on the best methods to overwinter and grow potatoes. And I tested out all these different methods. And honestly, accidentally not digging all of my potatoes in the summer, leaving them in the ground and letting them do their thing yielded better results than anything I tried in that series of videos, and was a lot less work. So that's the method that I'm going to be using from now on. And finally, if you followed along with the channel for a while, you know that my garden updates typically provide a little glimpse into what is going on over at my mom and pop's as well, because I have gardens over there. I've had quite a few folks ask, how do you have the time and energy to maintain all of that by yourself? And to keep it very real, I don't always. And this is one of those years. I haven't shown any updates over at my parents' place because right now, this is what it looks like. My mom's flowers are beautiful as always, but back here in the vegetable gardens, it's an awful lot of weeds. I am reevaluating my strategy for over there right now to make it more sustainably manageable. And the fact that it's a relatively large space that right now I manage by hand, I don't use any mechanical implements other than a small tiller. The biggest task is always weed control. Right now I'm heavily relying on silage tarps to solarize weedy areas, but even my go-to strategy of cover cropping is not working super well right now. It's been so hot that I've been having trouble getting cover crops established. When I was originally planning out this July garden update, I wasn't even going to show any updates of my parents' place. My pride didn't want me to. But when I stepped back and thought about it, I felt like sharing it was more important than my pride. And that is because even if you have a small garden, some years this is the reality. And that's okay, because the beauty of gardens are that you can step back and it will be there waiting for you next year. You might have a few more weeds, but it'll still be there. You can take the season off to plan and reevaluate and see what's going to work more sustainably for you in the future. I just don't want any of you to get so discouraged that you completely give up on this process, because it is a process, but it is one that I truly feel is worthwhile. I feel like videos that only show perfection in the garden are setting people up for, quite frankly, miserable failure, because a garden isn't always perfect. It's subject to weather, nature, the elements. There are so many things that can go wrong and do go wrong, and that's part of the beauty. So I'm hoping that me sharing my weedy mess might help some of you feel a little bit better about yours. But that's really all that I have going on in the garden here in July. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear about what is going on in your gardens right now. Drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And I promise you, I'm struggling to keep up with responding to all of your comments, but I do read them and I do appreciate them. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.